flight from Dallas to Washington was preparing for takeoff. A single father in a worn jacket and scuffed shoes led his 10-year-old son down the aisle, the boy's eyes wide with excitement over his very first flight. As they settled into their economy seats, a business-class passenger sneered, "Someone like you should feel lucky to even be here." A woman beside him added, "Don't dream about first class. Stay in coach, you're trash." The boy lowered his head, eyes stinging. His father said nothing. Then, 20 minutes later, 3 fighter pilots in uniform boarded the plane, saw the man, and snapped instantly to attention, saluting him as the entire cabin fell silent. Ethan Walker was 42 years old, a single father who worked as an auto mechanic and lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a small house on the edge of Dallas. The kind of house with a driveway that always needed repaving and a porch light that flickered slightly at night. He raised his son alone, without complaint, without asking anyone for help, and without ever once suggesting that the life he was living felt like a burden, even on the nights when it clearly was. His son, Noah, was 10 years old, sharp-minded beyond his years, and utterly obsessed with airplanes. The kind of kid who could identify a jet by the sound of its engine alone, and who spent hours sketching cockpits in the margins of his homework, dreaming quietly of becoming a pilot himself one day. 3 years earlier, tragedy had rearranged their entire world. Ethan's wife had died suddenly from a heart condition no one had seen coming, leaving him to become both mother and father overnight, and leaving Noah, still just a small boy at the time, withdrawn and quiet in a way that worried his teachers for months afterward. Ethan never spoke about how hard those first months had been, how many nights he sat alone in the garage long after Noah had fallen asleep, simply trying to hold himself together enough to face the next morning. He simply kept moving forward, the only way he knew how, working 12-hour shifts at the auto shop, saving every extra dollar he could, and rarely, if ever, spending anything on himself, not new shoes, not a proper winter coat, nothing beyond what Noah needed to grow up feeling like an ordinary, cared-for kid. The reason for their trip to Washington had nothing to do with vacation and everything to do with pride. Noah had entered a school writing contest, and out of dozens of essays submitted by his classmates, his had won first place. The essay was titled My Hero, and it was about his father, written in the plain, unpolished language of a 10-year-old who genuinely meant every word he wrote, describing a man who worked with his hands all day and still found the energy to help with homework every night, who never once complained about anything, no matter how tired he looked when he came home. The prize for winning was a guided tour of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, an opportunity Noah had talked about with such uncontainable excitement that Ethan quietly emptied what little remained of his savings account just to make sure the trip actually happened, buying 2 economy tickets he genuinely could not afford without a second thought. The night before the flight, as Ethan packed a single worn duffel bag for the both of them, Noah looked up at him with the particular seriousness only children seem able to summon out of nowhere and asked whether they were rich. Ethan laughed softly at the question, kneeling down to fold Noah's jacket into the bag before answering honestly. "No," he said, shaking his head, "but we have each other." Noah considered this for a moment, the way he considered most things his father told him, and then simply nodded, satisfied, as though that answer had settled something far bigger than the question itself ever suggested. It was a small exchange, spoken in a cramped bedroom the night before an early flight, but it carried within it something larger than either of them fully understood in the moment. A quiet truth that most children eventually come to learn far too late in life, that kids rarely need parents who are perfect, wealthy, or impressive in the eyes of strangers. What they need, more than anything else, is simply a parent who shows up, again and again, in the small, unglamorous moments that never make it into anyone's highlight reel. Folding laundry at midnight, sitting through a school play, driving 2 hours for a museum tour that costs more than a week of groceries. Ethan had never once thought of himself as extraordinary. He got up every morning, went to work, came home, and loved his son as fully as he knew how, and if anyone had asked him that night whether he considered himself a hero, he would have laughed at the question the same way he laughed at almost everything that felt too heavy to sit with directly. As he finally zipped the duffel bag shut and turned off the bedroom light, he had no idea that the ordinary flight ahead of them was about to unravel a part of his life he had spent years quietly trying to leave behind. The two of them boarded the plane together, Noah practically vibrating with excitement as he clutched the window seat ticket in his small hand, pointing out the wing, the engine, the tiny luggage carts moving across the tarmac below, narrating every detail to his father as though Ethan had never once seen an airport in his life. Ethan smiled and nodded along, letting his son's joy fill the cramped economy cabin the way sunlight fills a room, grateful, in that moment, that at least one part of the trip was unfolding exactly as he had hoped it would. Not everyone around them shared the same warmth. A wealthy passenger seated nearby, a real estate businessman named Richard Coleman, glanced over at their worn clothing with a visible curl of distaste crossing his face. The kind of look people give when they believe, quietly and completely, that they belong somewhere better than the people surrounding them. Richard had made his fortune flipping luxury properties across 3 states, and he had grown accustomed, over the years, to a certain kind of comfort that made ordinary economy travel feel almost beneath him, a temporary inconvenience he tolerated only because a private jet had not been available on short notice that particular week. He wore his success the way some people wear cologne, applying it liberally and expecting everyone around him to notice. When Noah leaned slightly into the aisle to catch a glimpse of the first-class cabin up ahead, unable to contain his curiosity about the wider seats and the extra legroom he had only ever seen in movies, Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to carry across several rows. Noah shrank back immediately, embarrassed. "I was just curious," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard laughed again, louder this time, clearly enjoying the small cruelty more than he should have. "Don't go dreaming about things that don't belong to you," he said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. A woman seated beside him, apparently a friend of his, chimed in with her own contribution to the moment. "Just stay and coach," she said flatly, glancing at Ethan's jacket and Noah's scuffed sneakers with open contempt. "You're trash." The words landed like a slap, and the air around their row grew instantly heavy with the kind of silence that follows cruelty spoken in public. A few nearby passengers glanced over, some visibly uncomfortable, though none of them said a word in response, the way people so often stay quiet when cruelty happens in front of them but not directly to them. Noah lowered his head, his eyes filling with tears he tried desperately to blink away before anyone could notice. His small hands twisting nervously in his lap, the excitement that had filled him only minutes earlier draining out of his small frame all at once. Ethan reached over and placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, leaning close enough that only Noah could hear him. "Don't let someone else's words decide your worth," he said quietly, his voice calm, carrying none of the anger someone else might have felt entitled to in that moment. It was a small sentence, spoken softly, but it carried the full weight of everything Ethan had learned the hard way over 4 decades of life. Lessons earned in places far harsher than a crowded airplane cabin. Places where the stakes were measured in something far more permanent than a stranger's opinion. There is a truth that people like Richard rarely stop to consider, a truth Ethan understood instinctively without ever needing to explain it aloud. Poverty does not make a person lesser, and the size of someone's bank account has never once determined the size of their character. Dignity is not something handed out by strangers glancing at your shoes from across an aisle. It is something carried quietly, from the inside, by people who have already survived far harder things than a stranger's judgment. People who learned long ago that the opinions of those who have never truly struggled carry very little weight in the end. Noah looked up at his father, still fighting back tears, and asked the question that had clearly been building inside him since the moment Richard first spoke. "Why do they hate us?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Ethan considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things Noah asked him, before answering with a small, tired smile. "Because sometimes people only see the clothes," he said gently. "They don't see the heart underneath them." Noah nodded slowly, turning the words over in his mind, absorbing them the way children absorb the lessons that matter most, quietly and completely, long before they fully understand why those lessons matter at all. Just as the tension in their row began to settle into an uneasy, lingering silence, the sound of the boarding door opening at the front of the cabin cut through the moment, drawing every passenger's attention forward at once, none of them yet aware of exactly how dramatically the next few minutes were about to rearrange everything they thought they understood about the tired-looking man sitting quietly in economy with his son. 3 men in military uniforms stepped through the boarding door, moving with the unmistakable posture of people trained to carry themselves a certain way even in the most ordinary settings, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere of the cabin before anyone even understood who they were. They were F-22 fighter pilots, dressed in their formal service uniforms, clearly traveling together on some kind of official assignment, and they made their way down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane, scanning the rows of economy seats with the casual awareness of people used to noticing everything around them. Then, without warning, one of them stopped mid-stride. His eyes landed on Ethan, and his expression shifted instantly from polite indifference to something closer to disbelief, as though he were staring at a memory that had suddenly, impossibly, stepped out of the past and into physical form directly in front of him. "Sir," he said slowly, his voice catching slightly. Is that really you?" Ethan looked up, momentarily confused, searching the young man's face for some flicker of recognition he couldn't quite place at first. Before he could respond, the pilot straightened his back, snapped his heels together, and raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute, the kind of gesture reserved for commanding officers and legends, not for a tired-looking man in a worn jacket sitting quietly in economy class with his son. The other two pilots, seeing their colleague's reaction, followed suit almost instantly, saluting in perfect unison without needing to ask a single question about why. The entire cabin fell into stunned silence. Richard's mouth dropped open mid-sentence, whatever cutting remark he had been preparing dying instantly on his tongue. A flight attendant, halfway through her boarding announcements, stopped completely, glancing between the three saluting pilots and the ordinary-looking man they were saluting, utterly unable to make sense of what she was witnessing. Passengers throughout the cabin twisted in their seats, craning their necks to see what had brought three military pilots to a dead stop in the middle of the aisle. The pilot who had spoken first finally lowered his hand and said the words that would rearrange everything the surrounding passengers thought they understood. "You're Colonel Ethan Walker," he said, his voice trembling slightly with something between reverence and disbelief. The air in the cabin turned instantly to ice. Ethan let out a long, slow breath, the kind of breath a person releases when a door they had carefully closed years ago suddenly swings open again without warning. And for a moment he said nothing at all, simply looking at the three young men standing in the aisle as though seeing ghosts from a life he thought he had permanently left behind. What followed was a revelation the entire cabin had been utterly unprepared for. Ethan Walker, it turned out, had once been a legendary F-22 fighter pilot, a man who had logged more than 2,000 hours of combat flight time across some of the most demanding missions in modern military history, and who had personally trained hundreds of younger pilots during his years of service, shaping an entire generation of aviators who now carried pieces of his instruction into cockpits around the world. The three men standing before him, still holding their positions with visible emotion, had each been his students once, years earlier, sitting in the same training rooms, absorbing the same lessons, never expecting to encounter their old instructor again under circumstances quite like this one. One of the pilots, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide, spoke directly to Ethan in front of the entire silent cabin. "If it weren't for you, sir," he said, "none of us would be here today." Noah stared up at his father, his expression somewhere between shock and disbelief, processing information that completely rearranged everything he thought he knew about the quiet, tired man who picked him up from school every day and fell asleep on the couch most nights before dinner was even finished. He had never once heard even a whisper of this part of his father's past. Not a single mention, not a single old photograph left carelessly on a shelf. Ethan finally began to explain, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment settling over the cabin. After his wife passed away, he told them, he had made the decision to leave military service entirely, walking away from a career built over decades in order to come home and raise his son properly, without the extended deployments and unpredictable schedules that would have pulled him away from Noah during the years his son needed him most. Then he said the sentence that silenced the entire cabin completely, passengers, flight attendants, and pilots alike hanging on every word. "There is no mission more important," he said quietly, "than being my son's father." One of the pilots standing in the aisle began to cry openly, no longer bothering to hide it, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand before speaking again. "You always taught us," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "that we had to protect the things that mattered most. There is a lesson buried inside moments like this one that most people rarely stop long enough to notice in their daily lives. The quiet sacrifices parents make, The careers abandoned, the promotions declined, the medals left folded away in drawers, so rarely announce themselves loudly enough for the rest of the world to see. They remain hidden, tucked into ordinary routines, invisible to strangers glancing across an airplane aisle. And yet those same sacrifices, unnoticed and unspoken for years, quietly build an entire world for a child who will spend the rest of their life standing inside it, often without ever fully understanding just how much it cost to construct. Richard sat frozen in his seat throughout the entire exchange, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his face with every passing second, replaced by something that looked distinctly like shame. The woman beside him, who only minutes earlier had called Ethan and his son trash without a moment of hesitation, stared down at her folded hands, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes, least of all Ethan's. Neither of them said a single word as the three pilots remained standing at attention, and neither of them seemed capable, in that moment, of reconciling the man they had mocked with the man three decorated fighter pilots had just addressed as a legend, a mentor, and quite possibly the reason they were alive to fly at all. Noah looked up at his father with an entirely different expression than the one he had worn only minutes earlier, something reshaping quietly behind his eyes as he tried to fit this new information into everything he thought he already knew about the man who packed his lunch every morning and drove him to school. "Are you really a hero, Dad?" he asked, his voice small, uncertain, still trying to make sense of it all. Ethan smiled gently and shook his head. "No," he said simply. "I just did my job." One of the pilots standing nearby, still visibly emotional, spoke up immediately, unwilling to let that particular answer stand uncorrected. "No, sir," he said firmly. "You saved a lot of lives." The words seemed to land somewhere deep inside Noah, and without warning, the tears he had been holding back since Richard's cruel remarks earlier in the flight finally broke free, spilling down his cheeks as he threw his arms around his father's neck. "I didn't know," he said quietly into Ethan's shoulder, his voice muffled and shaking. "I didn't know any of this." Ethan wrapped his arms around his son and held him close, resting his chin gently against the top of Noah's head the way he had done so many times before, in far quieter, far more ordinary moments than this one. "You don't need to know who I used to be," he said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly building behind it. "I only ever wanted to be your dad." The words drifted through the cabin, quiet but unmistakably clear, and several nearby passengers found themselves wiping at their own eyes, caught off guard by how deeply a single sentence, spoken so plainly, could cut through an entire plane full of strangers. Richard sat frozen for a long moment, watching the scene unfold in front of him, something shifting visibly across his face as the full weight of his earlier cruelty finally settled in. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, stood, and walked the short distance down the aisle toward Ethan, his usual confidence completely absent from his posture. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, extending his hand, his voice noticeably smaller than it had been just 20 minutes earlier when he was busy calling a 10-year-old boy trash in front of an entire cabin of strangers. Ethan looked at him for a moment, then reached out and shook his hand without hesitation, without bitterness, without the satisfaction some might have expected him to take in the moment. "We all make mistakes," Ethan said simply, his tone carrying no trace of resentment, only a kind of tired grace that seemed to come naturally to him after everything he had lived through. Richard nodded, unable to find any words adequate enough to match the moment, and returned to his seat carrying something he had clearly never expected to leave that flight with. A lesson about the danger of judging people by the clothes they wear or the seats they sit in, a lesson that no amount of money had ever managed to teach him before that day. He spent the remainder of the flight staring quietly out the window, saying very little, turning the entire encounter over slowly in his mind in a way that suggested it would stay with him considerably longer than the flight itself. For Noah, the lesson landed differently, settling into him not as guilt or embarrassment but as something closer to quiet, overwhelming pride, a feeling that would stay lodged in his chest long after the plane touched down, long after the museum tour ended, long after this particular afternoon faded into the more distant corners of memory. He had spent his whole life believing his father was simply tired, simply ordinary, simply doing what needed to be done to keep their small household running. He had never once imagined that the same quiet, unassuming man could also be the reason three grown men in military uniform had stopped mid-flight to salute him in front of an entire planeload of strangers. After the plane landed safely in Washington, the three pilots asked permission to give Noah a private tour of the cockpit before the rest of the passengers disembarked. An offer Noah accepted so quickly, he nearly tripped over his own feet standing up. Inside the cramped, instrument-filled space, they let him sit in the pilot's seat, walked him through the basic controls, and answered every rapid-fire question he could think to ask, clearly enjoying his enthusiasm as much as he was enjoying the experience itself. Before he climbed back out, one of them reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pilot's wings pin, pressing it carefully into Noah's palm. "We believe you're going to make a great pilot one day," he said, and Noah stared down at the small metal wings as though he had just been handed something far more valuable than gold. "I want to be just like you," Noah said, turning to look up at his father, who was watching quietly from just outside the cockpit door. Ethan smiled, the tired, genuine smile that had carried him through years most people never fully understood, and shook his head gently. "You don't need to be like me," he said. "You just need to become the best version of yourself." It was the kind of sentence that sounded simple on the surface but carried, underneath it, everything Ethan had learned across decades of flying, losing, rebuilding, and starting over, lessons he hoped his son would eventually absorb without needing to survive the same hardships to understand them. Later that afternoon, after they had finally made their way to the museum Noah's essay had won them a tour of, the two of them stood together outside the towering entrance, surrounded by full-scale aircraft suspended overhead and the quiet hum of visitors moving through the exhibits around them. Noah slipped his hand into his father's, looking up at him with an expression that mixed pride, wonder, and something quieter underneath both of those feelings. "I wrote in my essay that you were my hero," he said softly. "Today I found out I was right." Ethan pulled his son into a tight hug, his eyes glassy in a way he made no effort to hide, standing there in front of the museum for a long moment without saying anything at all, letting the silence hold everything words couldn't quite manage to say. Passers-by glanced at them briefly as they walked past, seeing nothing more than an ordinary father and son sharing a quiet moment outside a museum entrance, with no way of knowing anything about the flight that had brought them there or the salutes that had rearranged an entire cabin of strangers' assumptions just hours earlier. The trip that had begun with strangers calling them trash in the back of an economy cabin had somehow, by the end of a single afternoon, become something neither of them would ever forget, not because of the museum, not because of the salutes, but because of the quiet truth sitting underneath all of it. That the most ordinary-looking people, the ones easiest to overlook in a crowded airplane aisle, are so often carrying entire extraordinary lives folded quietly inside them, visible only to the people who take the time or get the chance to actually look. Noah would carry that lesson with him long after the wings pin found a permanent home on his bedroom shelf, long after the essay that started it all was tucked away in a drawer, and long after the memory of Richard's cruel words faded into something small and forgettable compared to everything else that flight had taught him about the man sitting beside him. Have you ever judged someone based only on the clothes they were wearing? Do you really know what the person sitting next to you has lived through? How many quiet heroes are walking around living completely ordinary lives that we never think twice about? And if you were that boy, how proud would you feel knowing the hero you wrote about, the one you looked up to more than anyone, was your own father all along? Never look down on people who live simply. The father sitting quietly in economy class may have once done something extraordinary. But the most extraordinary thing he ever did was walk away from all of it, to come home and become a boy's father.